Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alan Christie. I'm a professor in the Department of History, and I'm the chair of the Undergraduate Education Committee. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 17th annual Undergraduate Research Showcase for the History Department. We're going to have 7 talks, presentations from students who won awards for excellence in research and writing in the department this year. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing their presentations. I'm trying to use my classroom voice because we both have doors open. The mic and the camera are a little bit further back, and a fair number of people are sitting toward the back, so I'll encourage our presenters also to use your best classroom voice as you speak today. This is the 17th, as I said, annual showcase for history student research that we've had in the department. It began in 2008. By our chair at the time, Mark Traugut, who is now retired. I was a historian of France. And we've been doing this every year, and it's just been a fantastic event for everybody, I think. This is an opportunity for us to showcase and to, frankly, as faculty, show our pride in the great work that our students do, and also to express our gratitude and also our pride in our colleagues who mentored these wonderful projects. I will be mentioning the mentors in each case. I also like at this moment to point out that these are award-winning papers. They have won awards within the department, and they have won awards within the division, and they have won awards at the campus level. I will be mentioning a few of these. I will be mentioning all these awards when I introduce each speaker. As chair of the Undergraduate Education Committee, I sit on that committee that makes the divisional decisions, so all the papers from the different departments within the division. In my years of being in this position, I have to say that the history department has always won either the majority or at least the plurality. We take home more awards than any other department, so I have a tremendous amount of pride in that. I know that Jackson is presenting for the second time here. So we have a lot of really fabulous work, and having read through all of the essays, I can say that our students understand historical research. They understand historical discourse writing. They understand evidentiary rules in a way that really shines. This is not meant to denigrate our fellow students in the other departments in the campus, but the excellence of these papers was manifest to everybody, both on the committee itself and in the division. And so, especially proud of everybody for everything they've done. And it's a recognition for me as well of what a great job our department does in educating students in the discipline of history, which is a discipline that I think, as you'll be hearing from the papers today, is also one in which students demonstrate their ability to work in other kinds of disciplines as well in the service of a historical narrative. So the breadth of the education that our students are going to be presenting in their work, as well as the depth of their examinations and things, I think should be something that everyone can reflect upon. And it's certainly, for me, a manifestation of what the history department does. I think the past 8 years or so of these showcases have been videotaped and are available on our fantastic YouTube page. And so those of you who are presenting today will be able to go back and watch later on your fantastic presentations. I just had the pleasure of watching my remarks from last year to remind myself what to say today. And I can attest that it's up and running and doing fine. So without any further ado, because I think everybody should have as much time to present as possible, we're going to have 4 presentations in our first panel, and we'll follow that with a little bit of Q&A time for people to ask questions. We'll take a break from refreshments, which are in the next room. They're going to be in the back there, and also can spend some time in our finally lovely weather that we're getting here in mid-May. And then we'll convene again for 3 more presentations and then a Q&A to close out the day. So I'd like to begin our presentations with an introduction to Molly Maher, who is going to present their work for a paper called The Clubhouse that they did with Professor Mark Matera in his class on sex and the city. Molly is a major in history and psychology, double major, and they completed their degree in winter 2025, correct? So Molly won the History Department Linda Peterson Award in Social History. They won the History Department Hitchcock Award for Best Overall. They won the Chancellor's Award, one of the very few on the campus to win that. They won this year's Dean's Award as well. So this is a highly recognized, highly awarded talk that Molly will be giving us today. And with that, let me bring Molly on up to the podium. Thank you. You're going to use your own? Okay, so why don't you go ahead and use this.
Thank you for that kind introduction. All right. So my research is called the Clubhouse, and I thought I would start off by just talking about how I came to this topic, as the Clubhouse is in reference to a gay nightclub in a residential neighborhood in Washington, D.C. So, but I promise this is not just like a random club across the country. It is much more than that. But in the fall of last year, I knew I was going to be spending my last quarter as a student in DC doing the UCSC program, and so I kind of thought I would use my final senior project as a way to prepare and like research for my time there. I've always been really interested in spatial history and understanding the history of the world around me where I'm living, so I've spent a good amount of my time here doing other local history projects on the Santa Cruz area, and I thought it would kind of be full circle in my study of public history to end off studying the place where I'd be spending my last quarter. More notably though, I also knew that it would be really important for my emotional well-being, even safety as a queer person, to at least have some understanding of the queer subculture and history in DC. So as I dove into the history of queer movements in DC, I almost immediately recognized how closely intertwined race was with sexual and gender identity expression in the Capitol. A big part of the story starts with the segregation of DC and the rest of the United States, and how that gave roots to the communities that grew out of the DC area. Especially in this post-war era that was marked by a huge wave of diverse migration to the Capitol. With its basis in the racial segregation of public spaces, Black and white queer nightlife took on distinctly different forms in DC. The systematic exclusion of Black queer individuals from white gay bars produced a culture of house parties within historically Black neighborhoods as opposed to privatized businesses. With the basis of shared racial identity first and foremost, and with shared sexual identity as a secondary factor. The Clubhouse is a really useful example for understanding this transformation of Black queer nightlife in DC from the house party scene to the nightclub scene. Members of the Clubhouse repurposed a Petworth neighborhood warehouse in the city's outskirts into a bar-like space that ultimately became a hub for community-run education, political involvement, financial assistance, wellness, interventions, and family connections. By the 1980s, it evolved into a vital site of community care by offering sanctuary amidst systematic neglect and discrimination. Operating along the lines of intersection, race, class, and sexuality, the Clubhouse resisted the commodification of queer nightlife commonly seen in other white gay spaces, instead fostering networks of familial-like solidarity. Because membership was free, this non-transactional agreement of unspoken mutual understanding became the basis of continued community support from the Clubhouse. And these were some of my sources that I used. I wanted to play a snippet of a DJ set, but I don't think I have the time, fortunately. But I will talk a little bit about some of the sources. This, my favorite part of the project, as all projects, was the research part and looking through all my sources. This specifically was super fun to do because A, it's a nightclub that I'm researching, which is awesome, and B, queer people know how to make really cool party posters. But this, I think, was my favorite source. While there were some cool posters, this was a poem about the Clubhouse, and it's really simple, but it somehow made me feel like more immersed into the Clubhouse than any of the like archived live recordings I found. It really stuck with me. So when I sat down to try to come up with a name for my project or for my paper, I kind of felt like none of my creative words could do it justice. So I instead chose to open my paper with a snippet of this poem instead of trying to come up with some elaborate, long-winded humanities academic history paper thing. And this was another one of the posters kind of that I used, I really focused on. But with the AIDS epidemic devastating queer communities across the nation, the clubhouse became a pivotal site of African American activism, hosting events like the AIDS Forum for Black and Third World Gays in September of 1983 to fill the void left by the public health neglect. The clubhouse's outreach around AIDS support highlighted the feelings of interconnectedness in the Black queer DC community, using language like "we owe it to ourselves" and reminding its members to encourage your friends to attend their informational settings. The rallying cry on the promotional poster for the AIDS Forum read, "Together, let's educate ourselves to live." The clubhouse became a safety net for community members, using empowering and unifying language to motivate their patrons to reach out for the services they needed, offering medications delivery, transportation to doctor's appointments, and rent support. The government's neglect during the AIDS epidemic is emblematic of the United States' larger history of disregarding the needs of marginalized communities, one I'm sure we're all very familiar with by now. And these systematic prejudices in combination with the Reagan administration's unwillingness to allocate resources or enact policies that could have alleviated the epidemic's devastation left community spaces like the clubhouse to shoulder the burden of care, stepping in without institutional support to very literally save the lives of people within their community. And only 2 weeks after the inauguration, when I was in DC in the winter, I actually accidentally found myself in the Petworth neighborhood as I was going to a work meeting for my internship. And I initially planned to make a whole day trip out of it, but I just could not help myself but to go see this building that I had spent hours looking at on Google Maps. And so while the gray skies against a kind of beige, what is now a vet center is kind of underwhelming to you, I was like absolutely struck by it as I had read all of these government documents about the building, the history of ownership, I knew the measurements, all of these little details. It was very exciting for me. But what really stuck out to me as well was surrounding crosswalks and the manhole covers were freshly spray painted with what I kind of consider to be pretty basic calls for human rights, but also could be seen as political calls to action. And it kind of reassured this sense that the activist spirit was still alive and well in Petworth. I hope this research can be a reminder of the importance of uplifting community spaces like the clubhouse. The political power of community, even in the form of a nightclub, should not be underestimated. Now more than ever, we can feel the insufficiency of our government protecting our civil liberties, and we must lean into our community networks. Sustained community centered in mutual aid, like the clubhouse, will always overpower the bureaucratic structures that prioritize capital over the collective. As said best by the clubhouse, it's us helping us.
There's much to appreciate in Molly's paper. One of the things that I appreciate, and I think many of the faculty do, is a reminder that a lot of historical research is field research. What you said about the thrill of seeing the building, even if it's not so thrilling for everybody else, I totally feel that so often in my own work. And so thank you. All the other papers have fabulous dimensions to them, but I wanted to call out Molly's field work as one of the distinctive elements of it. So thank you so much. Our next paper is by V. Iger. This is a paper that V did in a seminar with Professor Alma Heckman, Exile, Diaspora, and Displacement, Jewish Lives from North Africa to the Middle East. V is a major in History of Art and Visual Culture with a history minor, another nice combination, I think, and is graduating spring of 2025. V has won the History Department's Linda Peterson Award in the History of Material Culture, and also a Dean's Award this year. And this is a pretty fascinating, I was struck by how far you went with jewelry, far beyond what I thought I could imagine doing. Pete, why don't you come up?
Welcome, and thank you for listening to this ahead of time. My project is called Adorned in Exile, and it explores how Algerian Jewish jewelry acts as a material archive, preserving memory and identity across time. I just wanted to situate ourselves by looking at the map of Algeria. Algeria was once home to a vibrant Amazigh Jewish and Muslim community. It became a French colony in 1830. After independence in 1962, 90% of all the Algerian Jews went to France and others to Israel, shaped in part by the Communauté, which had granted Jews French citizenship unlike their Muslim neighbors. This map traces that journey and sets the stage for how memory travels in metal, craft, and form. We're going to stay on this slide. I'd like you to just look at this triangular amulet and take it in and see what it evokes inside of you. My name is Varadya Iger, and this project was written for Professor Alma Rachel Heckman in her course, Exile, Diaspora, and Displacement, Jewish Lives from North Africa to the Middle East. This amulet is called a fibula, and it acts both as a symbolic and protective mechanism as well as being practical and worn on clothing. It's memory in metal, carried on the body and passed between generations. Algerian Jewish jewelry functions as a vessel of memory, preserving identity across centuries of migration and change. This project uses a visual material culture lens to trace how these forms, especially jewelry, adapted while preserving ancestral knowledge. My project asks, how did Jewish, Muslim, and Amazigh artisans shape these traditions before colonialism? What happened when French rule and Zionism fractured those networks? And how in diaspora do these objects speak of continuity, resilience, and reclamation? On this slide, there are two Algerian Jewish women wearing this fibulae, and here are two other examples of them. And you can see that they are used to attach their clothing, but they're also protective. And also this fibula is worn on the headscarves as well as in this picture. So the fibulae, the triangular shape, symbolizes fertility, power, feminine fertility, power, and connects to nature. Inscribed in them are both Islamic and Judaic symbols, and the enameling of the blue, the yellow, and the green represent the elements of the earth. During colonial displacement and the Communauté, these objects, Algerian Jewish objects, including garments that were embroidered in gold and elaborate in their style, were brought to the West, brought to Europe, and then exotified and put on display in museums and in the Great Exhibition. This particular garment is a wedding garment that is on display at Musée du Quai Branly, and it's, as you can see, it's become like an ethnographic artifact. As Azulai reminds us, such displays reflect a colonial lens, not preserving heritage, but reframing it to fit imperial narratives. When we arrive at post-1962 evolution in France and Israel, I'm just going to focus in on Israel because this is a piece from the museum in Israel, and it's hybridizing the elements we see in the fibula that I showed you earlier. It has all of the elemental qualities, but it's on this chainmail, and it's now integrated into a broader Mizrahi identity. Today, artists like Hama Muftali are reclaiming the legacy of this tradition in Algerian Jewish jewelry making. And you can see on this painting, both of these paintings are by her. In the Shulamith, you can see the triangular fibula, and here she's wearing it as a breastplate. Hama Muftali, through her platform on Moors and Saints, it's also a collective of artists, and they actually have a physical location. She creates jewelry and visual art rooted in Jewish and Amazigh identity. She writes, "We are here to decolonize beauty and reclaim memory." Her work reactivates these symbols not as nostalgia, but as sites of cultural reclamation and continuity. Algerian Jewish jewelry is a vessel of memory, preserving identity across rupture, migration, and reinvention. From traditional fibulae to contemporary design, these forms remain a living thread of cultural transmission. So I leave you with this. What does it mean for the Jewish diaspora to inherit a tradition born in shared artisan guilds, artisan worlds, fractured by empire, and now reclaimed through art? What does it mean to carry beauty made in exile and remake it as resilience? Thank you. And thank you to Professor Heckman, who couldn't be here today. She's teaching the class.
I don't know if I can make a comment on every one of the papers, but in this one I'm also reminded that as historians we work with traces of the past in many ways. They can be textual, they can be material, they can be visual. So this is another wonderful example of how the breadth of research that our students can do. Our next speaker is Julie Pintamont. She is a history BA intensive major, so this means extra research work and language study. She's presenting a paper that she wrote in Professor Kate Jones' class on the U.S. Civil War and Reconstruction. This was a paper that won the History Department Linda Peterson Award for Political History. And the title of the paper is Confederate Nationalism, the Rise and Fall of the Confederacy.
Hi everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon. Contrary to what the title says, this is not like a devil's advocate for the Confederate nationalism, which, sorry about that, but this is actually an investigation on what what nationhood in the Confederacy looked like for the small period of time that it existed, and whether it succeeded in convincing, the people of the South of its legitimacy. And what I discovered through my research on this paper was that the Confederacy was defined by this capitalist political planter elite class in order to protect the institution of slavery. And while Confederates tried to implement a sense of nationalism past this top class, it stayed disproportionately popular amongst the planter elites, as working class citizens often still felt ties with the Union and prioritized their families' needs over national interests, especially towards the end of the war. I use Benedict Anderson's definition of the nation as an imagined community, political community in which people who have never met nor interacted with each other and who may never meet feel a sense of commonality with each other as a theoretical framework for my understanding of Confederate nationalism. And I use a variety of different sources, newspapers, speeches given by political figures, flags, newspapers, and letters to kind of showcase how Confederate the nation was imagined and how the national identity was constructed. And I also use soldier diaries, letters between family members, desertion statistics, and letters written to political figures to convey this deterioration of the Confederate nation as the war raged on. So before I started just like doing research on the Confederacy when it was like first started with the secession, I had to investigate before the secession and look at how like this nation was sort of being built up prior to secession. And so the issue of slavery was like the heart of questions of whether or not Southern slave states would actually secede from the nation. There was a sectional divide between the North and South as Southerners saw themselves as more of a planter agrarian economy, while the North was more textile production industry. And so Northerners were constructed, especially in newspapers, as the great enemy of the South and a threat to Southern economy and society. And many pro-slavery Southerners believed that Northerners, if given the chance, would quickly abolish slavery, leaving the Southern agrarian economy in the dust. This fear was often exacerbated in newspapers and pamphlets distributed in the South, creating a sense of urgency for those who staunchly believed in the continuance of slavery in the United States. And pro-slavery Democrats built up a fear around whether or not this slavery would exist in the post-1860 election, and promoted the idea of secession should a Republican president take office. So when a Republican president, Lincoln, took office, 11 Southern states quickly seceded from the Union, and this kick-started the Civil War, which led to a need to mobilize men for the military. And in order to do this, Confederates exploited perceptions of masculinity in the South, conflating manhood with a duty to the nation. Men who joined the Confederate Army were often celebrated, while those who avoided the military were characterized as cowardly, both by the state and by their neighbors and people in their community. One Confederate woman named Mary Bott refused to speak to any man she knew who was eligible to join the military, but didn't. And so this next section, I talked about the creation and construction and cultivation of a national identity during the war. And so in order to kind of legitimize themselves, Confederates created historical ties between the birth of the Confederacy and the Revolutionary War and the birth of the United States. Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, was often compared to George Washington, and George Washington was put on postage stamps and Confederate seals in order to further embed historical ties between the Confederacy and the birth of the U.S. in 1776. Christianity also played a major role in the construction of Confederate nationhood, as Confederates believed their nation to be a nation of God's own planting. The Civil War was a war waged in God's name, and Confederates believed that God would grant them a new nation in which states' rights, but more importantly, slavery was protected. Lastly, in order to further embed a sense of nationhood across the South, Confederates used everyday symbols, also known as banal nationalism. This is what Michael Rose defined as banal nationalism. Everyday representations of the nation, symbols such as the Confederate flag, so that people could associate themselves with a military symbol. The flag alongside postal stamps, banknotes, and music served in constructing a shared national identity in the South and building an imagined Confederate nation state after the war. And so this last section was really about how this sense of nationalism failed to convince the majority and move past the top center elite class. As the war, which was previously thought to be a quick and easy win, continued, months turned into years of battle. Fighting for the nation was no longer convincing enough for Confederate soldiers. A year into the war, the Confederacy passed the Conscription Act, which was the first draft, and drafted able-bodied men to serve in the military, leaving women to take care of the household and maintain the land or earn income in the absence of their husbands. And this created a lot of stress for women, and they often wrote about these stresses to their husbands who were serving in the military, which led to many men deserting their positions in the military to be reunited with their families rather than continuing to fight for a seemingly hopeless war. And perhaps the most convincing source of evidence that this Confederate nationalism didn't really work was the persistent unionist pockets within the South, especially in more metropolitan areas where a lot of the industry wasn't really based in agrarian agriculture economy, and where a lot of immigrants were resided. The existence of unionists in the South was detrimental to the Confederate nationalism, as it exposed the limitations of this national identity and its failures to convince people across socioeconomic classes of its legitimacy. So even though the war ended and the Confederates lost the battle, this sense of Confederate nationalism has kind of been reinvented and rebirthed through narrative historical narrations of the Confederacy in historical writings. The South, after the Civil War ended, the South's role was portrayed as a patriotic role in which Southerners fought valiantly to protect their states' rights, and the role that slavery played was often cast aside, and this lost cause narrative was kind of built up and overshadowed the real issue, which was slavery. With the end of the Civil War, the persistence of Confederate nationalism is evident through the creation of organizations that promoted this history, like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, as well as politically with the rise of Jim Crow laws and legislation immediately following the Reconstruction era, and also the rise of the KKK after the Civil War. The effects of Confederate nationalism can even be felt today, as Confederate flags are still flown in certain places and has become associated with as a far-right symbol and with what could have been internal narrative. So, thank you.
All right, we move from material history to history of imagination and its shortcomings. So thank you so much, Julie. Our last talk in this section is by Michael Robinson. Michael did this paper in Bruce Thompson's course on modern Irish history. Michael is a double BA in classical studies and a BA history intensive degree. Michael won the History Department Linda Peterson Award and also the Dean's Award. So a lot of recognition, I think, of the excellence of your work. And so with this, we will now hear from Michael Robinson speaking about Ireland's closed shores, the influence of anti-Semitism on Irish refugee policy during the Holocaust.
national identity as a new nation, and these were anti-immigration and anti-immigration policies, so they were very protectionist, and these policies led to economic problems, which ended up increasing public anti-immigration feeling. So Irish nationalism, unlike other European nationalisms, did not particularly focus on Jews as a national other, but there was present anti-Jewish feeling, both political and religious. So this is an example of nationalist, anti-Jewish. Griffith was a founder of the Nationalist Party, Sinn Féin, and into the 19th century he said that Jews were one of the three evil influences, and this article is from the fascist newsletter in 1937, which blamed Jews for the division of Ireland. So nationalism led to very strong anti-immigration sentiment in Ireland, and in 1935 they implemented their first formal immigration policy, which was the Irish Citizens Act and the Aliens Act of 1935. And the Aliens Act was influenced by the British Aliens Act of 1905, which was actually implemented to slow Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe into Britain, and required refugees to prove that they were refugees. So it was coming from anti-immigration feeling, and that was passed into the new Irish Aliens Act, which permitted discrimination, and its full enforcement was given to the Department of Justice, which meant that the people in that department could decide how to enforce it. So people were very much dependent on the sympathies of the people in that department. And one of the policies was that immigrants had to be fully self-sufficient, and which was a problem, of course, for refugees who often had nothing and couldn't, support themselves. And Ireland also had a policy of neutrality during the war, which also affected their immigration policy, because they didn't want to show any sympathies to either side. And so the policies were especially difficult for refugees, especially Jewish refugees, because they were often deprived of their property as well as their citizenship in the countries that they were coming from. So these requirements that they have means and have sponsors and work permits were especially difficult for them. And then the policy was not just harder on Jewish refugees by chance, but by design, because of this department, because the Department of Justice was allowed to make their own decisions regarding how to enforce their policies. Anti-Jewish feeling within that department led to explicitly anti-Jewish policies. We were advised by the Coordinating Committee for the Relief of Christian Refugees, who, unsurprisingly, pressured them to accept Christian refugees over Jewish refugees, which then became an official policy of the department. They made a statement that they weren't interested in helping Jewish refugees first, because they said there was enough money in Jewish communities elsewhere, and they also stated that they didn't want Jewish immigration because they thought they wouldn't assimilate. So there were two different anti-Jewish prejudices here, that they're not going to assimilate, and that Jewish communities have money, so they'll just take care of their own, we don't need to be there, help them. And within Ireland, the Irish Jewish community was also told not to pressure the government to accept more refugees, and Irish and Jewish refugees were also had higher expectations that they would not just be able to support themselves, but they would be an active benefit to Ireland, so they had a higher level to meet before they would even be considered. And the Irish minister in Germany also disapproved Jewish applications for asylum. So there were multiple levels of challenges. And then, aside from the active anti-Jewish policy, there was also apathy from those who were in a position and who seemed to be of a mind to promote a better immigration policy that was more sympathetic. Among De Valera was and the Minister of External Affairs during the war. So he had both influence and he was fully aware of the severity of the situation. And according to those records, he had a generally positive relationship with the Irish Jewish community. But despite this, he did not press for more accepting policy. And he would make statements that were generally in support of the Jewish community and in support of refugees, but did not back that up with any actual action. And was considered, his reasons for this were likely self-interest, political self-interest, because neutrality was very popular. Immigration was very unpopular, and he had already had political challenges. He was on the losing side of the Irish Civil War, so he wanted to keep his power more than he wanted to actually be helpful to the Jewish community. And he was also very single-minded. And you can see in this statement, he said, this is about neutrality. He said, I acted very deliberately, and I'm not going to make any explanations because I don't want to be accused of doing something wrong, and I did what I thought was right. So he was very self-righteous, and he did not go back and reconsider after making a decision, which also was a problem. So the results of these policies and these failures to act, difficult to find a clear number, but it's also that nearly 60 Jewish refugees were admitted in Ireland over this period, and these anti-Jewish immigration policies continued into the 1950s, and De Valera still has
single Michael out for having the most exquisite citations. Right? I know that for other companies, the idea of footnotes is giving you the greatest pleasure, maybe kind of weird, but I read Michael's paper and kept thinking, yeah, good citation. So this is true for everybody, but thank you so much. We are just a little bit behind time, but I think we can take 5 minutes for questions now. If anybody has some questions, we'll have some more time to do that. We'll have another Q&A afterwards. So does anyone have a question for any of our speakers? Yes. Greg O'Malley.
I have a question for Molly. I'm curious about a little bit more. You mentioned the sort of transition from a house party scene to this being a little bit more of a public space. And I was hoping to learn just a little bit more about how this was organized in terms of like acquiring the building to house this operation. Was it donated? Was it organized as a nonprofit? Like how did they get the space for the club?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. So the house party scene was like a huge thing for a long time in DC, where instead of having, there would be names of bars that were popular for white queer people, but then it would be like names of people whose house you would go to. So a big one was this guy named Michael Burton, and he helped establish, I think, him and a group of people helped establish this club that came before the clubhouse called the Third World. And that was all volunteer and donation run, and so was the clubhouse because membership was free. But it really was kind of people bringing, you know, I can't put enough emphasis on like the concept of like mutual aid. It really was a people bringing what they had to like give to each other, and I think also part of what made the house party scene so relevant to it is it really having the nightlife be in the home made it so that a lot of this community network felt very family-like, and that was very close to the family, both physically by being in the home, but also, you know, a lot of people, I listened to a lot of oral histories, and there's a lot of mention of people, certain moms being super relevant in these, in the nightclub, which I thought was so interesting, but it really was like a whole family affair, and so I think it just kind of extended outside of the home, and they were able to make some money from the house parties, and I think that was what they initially used to invest.
Kate, do you have a question?
Yeah, I realize we're short on time. I just wanted to invite, thanks to all of y'all. That was really great presentations all the time. I got to read the papers too. I was just curious if anyone had a particularly exciting moment with finding evidence in your research or something that really struck you. If anyone who spoke wanted to volunteer, if there was a particularly thrilling discovery. We're always curious about that sort of stuff.
The reason I chose the fibula was because it was fascinating how the artisans prior to colonialism worked together, the Muslims and the Jews, to embed prayers inside of the jewelry. And they just worked alongside each other for thousands of years doing this kind of craft. And I thought it's like a portable sense of memory, an archive through time, you know, through societal changes, politics, this beautiful piece of memory. Yeah.
Yeah, Mom.
Yeah, as I mentioned, party posters and event posters were a huge source for me, and that really helped me establish a timeline that was more concise than I was able to get, where I could kind of go back into some of the oral histories and see where people might have misremembered dates and stuff, and was able to kind of go back and correct that. And it also, as someone who, me and my friends like to make a lot of posters for different events we do, really made me rethink what a historical artifact
many job talks for the history department, and I can say that, well, we often ask questions about, about what they're trying to say, what kind of theoretical, improvements they're trying to make. It's off the question when somebody says, tell us about your archival experience, when we all lean forward like, oh yeah, that one. So thank you, Kate, for reminding us of that joy. And thank you, Molly and Dee and Julie and Michael for these great presentations. Let's take a few minutes to stretch, maybe have a little refreshment, and then we will come back for our second panel with 3 more presentations. Thank you. All right. The first paper of our afternoon will be presented by Valerie Sines. Valerie, you're going to hear a common theme here. Valerie was is, for another month, a double major in history and the history of art and visual culture. It's an intensive BA in the history department. That means more seminars, more research, language learning, and whatnot. So, and Valerie will be graduating in spring of 2025. Valerie's presentation today will come from a class that she took, a paper she wrote in Professor Greg O'Malley's class on the history of the Atlantic world, 1492 to 1824. This paper won the History Department's Linda Peterson Award in Religious History and the Dean's Award. And now I will make a shot at pronouncing this name on the screen. The paper is titled Takeri Takakwatha, Praise from the Pulpit, Power of the Pines. Valerie?
Was a 17th century Mohawk woman born in 1656. She survived smallpox as a child, which left her scarred and with poor eyesight. At age 19, she converted to Catholicism at the Jesuit mission of the Salt and became known for her extreme acts of penance. She fasted, she walked barefoot in the snow, she added ashes to her food and whipped herself with birch rods until she bled, among other physically damaging forms of penance. And she died at the age of 24 due to these extreme forms of penance, and was later canonized as the first Native American Catholic saint in 2012. Some more context as to the when and where. So Kateri lives in Kanawaki. This is the best map I could find. The circle, that's where the mission of the Salt is. So this is near modern-day Montreal. At this time, this area was part of the Mohawk territory, one of the nations that make up the Iroquois Confederacy. In the 17th century, Catholic priests from France, from an order called the Jesuits, came to this region with a mission to convert indigenous people to Christianity. The Jesuits believed that it was their religious duty to save indigenous souls by turning them into Catholics. But conversion wasn't just about belief. It was also meant to try to change people's way of life, their culture, their traditions, and their connection to their land. So this is where they established the mission of Salt where Kateri resided. The idea was just to bring indigenous converts to live closer together, away from their original religions, so they can practice Catholicism under Jesuit supervision. Right. To study Kateri, I had to rely heavily on Jesuit sources, like the Jesuit Relations and Allied Documents, which is essentially just a collection of annual narratives that the Jesuit priests wrote about their work at various missions in the Americas to report back to Europe. I also looked at very personal writings by Jesuit priests like Father Shotieri, I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry, who knew Kateri during her lifetime. And I had to rely on these because they were the only primary sources I could find about her life. So I had to take into account that these are written entirely in a missionary perspective. So when I was reading through these sources from the Jesuit Relations collections, I came across this source from 1680, which was the year that Kateri died, that basically started my research and made me question the whole narrative about her sainthood. It's pretty long, so I'll only focus on this chunk, but I'll ask that you pay attention to the kinds of indigenous people in this area were practicing. So this is written by a Jesuit priest. The demon who saw the glorious success of this mission used another kind of battery. Transfiguring himself as an angel of light, he urged on the devotion of some persons who wished to imitate Catherine or to do severe penance for their sins. He drove them into excess, in order, no doubt, to render Christianity hateful even at the start, or in order to impose upon the girls and women of this mission, whose discretion has never equaled that of Catherine, whom they tried to imitate. There were savage women who threw themselves under the ice in the midst of winter. One had her daughter dipped into it, who was only 6 years old, for the purpose, she said, of teaching her penance in good season. Savages, both men and women, covered themselves with blood by disciplinary stripes with iron, with rods, with thorns, with nettles. They fasted rigorously, passing the entire day without eating, and what the savages eat during the half of the year is not sufficient to keep a man alive. These fasting women toiled strenuously all day in summer, working in fields, in winter cutting wood. These austerities were almost continual. They mingled ashes in their portion of sagamite. They put glowing coal between their toes where the fire burned a hole in the flesh. They went bare-legged to make a long procession in the snows. They all disfigured themselves by cutting off their hair in order to not be sought in marriage. These things and all the harm that they could do to their body, which they called their greatest enemy, reduced them so low that it was not possible for ill-fed men to persevere further. Most of these things took place in the woods, where the savages were then hunting or under enthusiastic excess of indignation against themselves. Well, the Holy Ghost soon intervened in this matter, enlightening all these persons, and regulated their conduct without diminishing their fervor. After reading this, I asked myself, why are these indigenous people being criticized for doing basically the same extreme acts of penance that Katri did? As far as I'm aware, Katri was also famously known for fasting and whipping and all these other quote-unquote austerities that this Jesuit priest describes. It was in this contradiction between praising Katri and condemning the others for the same acts that I started my starting point for the research, and I wanted to find out why she, in particular, was praised and venerated, and these converts were condemned. What was it that set her apart from the rest of the group? So to explore this contradiction, I first decided I need to understand the Iroquois religious beliefs first for proper context. I go into way more detail in my paper, and I don't really have time to go too much into it. But one of the parts that I learned about their religious beliefs, I learned about this Iroquois culture theory called Okwirase, and in this belief, he's also known as the creator, and he gave the people the Owentan Kariwatikwin, sorry, I can't pronounce it, or the words that become before all else, which were basically instructions on how to care for the earth and guidance for 4 sacred ceremonies that help balance joy in the community. Before leaving Earth, Okwirase entrusted humans with the responsibility to protect and nurture the land, and he established dreams specifically as a sacred way of communication. Dreams were seen as messages from the Creator, offering guidance and revelation, and interpreting them was an essential part of life. To help receive these dreams, the Iroquois people practiced rituals like fasting, they used sweat lodges, chanting, or even self-harm in order to for sensory deprivation to reach these dreamlike states. European missionaries, however, misunderstood this deep spiritual relationship with Jesus. Even one Jesuit priest that I found wrote that while I was looking in my research, he wrote, quote, the Iroquois have, properly speaking, one single divinity, the dream. To it they render their submission and follow all of its orders with the utmost exactness. This led me to wonder, could these extreme acts that the Jesuits interpreted as Catholic penance actually have been rooted in Iroquois spiritual practices? Are these indigenous people still practicing their traditions under the guise of penance? From the archives, I just began to see these patterns that supported my assumptions. First and foremost, what I kind of just already described, I was determined that Catri's penance was not unique. Other indigenous converts practiced the same extreme austerities, but while Catri was praised, they were criticized. I confirmed these through the writings by priest Chautier that Catri was known for extreme fasting, whipping, walking barefoot in the snow, also putting ashes in her meal I presented earlier in the 1680 report, they were doing the exact same things, but instead they were said to be trying to imitate Catturi, but in excess. After rereading these sources, and having already informed myself about their religious beliefs, it sounded awfully close to what they were used to doing traditionally in order to reach these dreamlike states. I was also noticing some other double standards that they had for Catturi. For example, in one source, I learned that Catturi had cut her hair when she came of age to marry in order to seem undesirable and thus avoid marriage. However, she was praised for this and claimed that they claimed that she did this to preserve her chastity. However, in that other source that I read, that Jesuit priest read it as they were trying to evade marriage, and he listed it in the types of penance that he called undesirable. Another striking thing that I noticed was how the priests began attributing holiness to Catturi from a very young age, even before her conversion to Catholicism. The father showed here wasn't just documenting her behavior. I felt he was actively shaping a narrative that she was born holy. For instance, he claimed, quote, "This child never did anything that might be said to offend God. She had a certain natural modesty, which is the guardian of chastity." In other words, he portrayed her as innately pure, suggesting that she had an instinctive understanding of Christian virtue. He even attributed the effects of her smallpox scars, which he called ugliness, to her face and her eye sensitivity, as blessings, because according to him, they protected her from being sought after by men and helped her preserve her virginity. Later, he also described her as a gentle, chaste, innocent, and well-behaved, and behaved like a well-bred French child. That phrase in particular really stayed with me because it shows how he was measuring her worth by European standards of femininity and moral behavior. And in my paper, I argue that this was not a culturally neutral portrayal, but it was a deliberate construction. He wasn't just describing who Catturi was, but he was framing her as the ideal indigenous convert, someone who could naturally fit into the colonial Catholic worldview. Her sainthood then becomes not just a recognition of personal holiness, but as a tool used by Jesuits to promote their mission and hold up a model for others to emulate. And lastly, there's a lot more evidence that I use, but one more that I can include, which is another key way that the Jesuit writings promoted Catturi's sainthood, was through the subtle inclusion of posthumous miracles. After her death, Jesuit reports carefully placed her near miraculous events, creating a narrative that she continued to have a spiritual influence from beyond the grave. For example, in one account, it is written that, quote, "Earlier in the evening, all three priests had gone to visit the grave of Catturi to pray after, just before a chapel was destroyed by a whirlwind." And even though the text doesn't explicitly say that Catturi saved them, their connection is clear. The priests prayed at her grave, and they survived the disaster. Now, in my paper, I explained that including this small detail helps to often imply that Catturi is someone who is considered worthy of veneration by those in the Jesuit order. And I think it's a subtle but powerful way of elevating her to sanctity without directly claiming that she did a miracle. And when I read this, I realized how Catturi's story was being woven into miracle narratives, not just as a matter of faith, but as a way to promote her sainthood to European audiences and to prove the success of the Jesuit mission. By showing that even after her death, she was protecting the mission and the priests, they were reinforcing her image as a holy figure and justifying the work in the Americas. Together, these patterns, her exaggerated innate holiness, the selective praise of her penance, and the double standards around her refusal of marriage, and these miracle stories led me to conclude that Catturi's sainthood wasn't just about personal devotion. It was a constructive narrative shaped by Jesuit writers to serve colonial goals, promoting conversion, regulating indigenous behavior, and proving the mission's effectiveness. And as I wrote in my paper, the narrative sets limits on how indigenous holiness could be recognized, validating only those who fully conform to Jesuit ideals. In other words, Catturi's story wasn't just a story of faith, it was a story of control and shaping indigenous identity within narrow colonial definitions personal devotion. It served colonial goals. And by holding up Cattry as a success story, the Jesuits created an example of what an ideal convert looked like. But at the same time, they condemned others in her community who tried to imitate her intense devotion by saying they were going too far or practicing incorrectly. In doing so, they created a space where they held complete authority, where they could decide what was Catholic enough. By praising Cattry, but criticizing others, they kept the bar high and unattainable, ensuring that no one else could truly reach this status. This allowed them to maintain control over Indigenous converts, encouraging them to strive for holiness while never fully allowing them to achieve it. So I think her story pushes us to ask difficult but important questions. Who holds the power to tell history? Whose voices get elevated? And for what purposes? Thank you.
One of the moves that historians make is we put things into context, right? And the way that Valerie brought these two contexts of the indigenous beliefs and the Catholic beliefs is a really important move that she made, and I want to really applaud her for that move. It's one of the things that I take the most joy in. Our next speaker is Jackson Young. Jackson has his second time up here at the podium from last year. He was part of a group who presented their work. Jackson is presenting a paper that he did in a class with Professor Kate Jones, U.S. Civil War and Reconstruction. He is a history BA and, the pattern, a minor in the history of art and visual culture, who is graduating in the fall of this year. This paper won the History Department Linda Peterson Award in African American history, and he will now talk to us about his paper called In the Wake of Freedom, the Effects of Sherman's March on the Black Population of Liberty County, Georgia.
Hi everybody, my name is Jackson Young, and my project is In the Wake of Freedom, the effects of Sherman's March on the Black population of Liberty County, Georgia. So I wanted to start this presentation off with a photo. A lot of my extended family is from Georgia, but my great-grandparents moved out to the Midwest during the Great Migration. And there was a photo just like this one, not this exact one, this one's from North Carolina. There was a photo just like this one sitting on my grandmother's coffee table, all growing up. And I was transfixed by the photo. And I was a really nervous kid, and one time I mustered up the courage to ask my great-uncle what it was, and I knew what it was. It's just kids wanting confirmation. And he looked at me and told me that it's our old folks chillin' slave style. I thought that was the funniest answer, but the photo did truly intrigue me. And I always looked at their eyes and thought about the series of events that would have led to their freedom, the sense of jubilee they would have felt in attaining it. Some people bring up cases of peonage lasting late in the 20th century and other extreme cases to show that slavery affected people today, but I think that's unnecessary. I was born at the turn of the 21st century, and I saw this photo every summer multiple times and looked in their eyes and wondered. So that's kind of what I brought to this project, and I really aim to catalog these emancipation events through these people's eyes. And to do that, I looked through the Southern Claims Commission files, which was a federal program created during Reconstruction that allowed for union-supporting Southerners to petition the government for reimbursement for their property, which might have been destroyed or otherwise requisitioned by the Union Army during the war. And black people and freedmen in general were considered to be Union men by default. So barring any kind of irregularities in their claims, they were generally accepted by the commission. Looking into these claims in Georgia, I found that Liberty County had a large amount of black people who submitted claims, and I wanted to look into what created the circumstances in which all these claims have been made. So I looked further into Liberty County during the war. I found that it was located 24 miles southeast of Savannah and less than 5 miles east of the Confederate stronghold of Fort McAllister. This was not in Sherman's general path, it was outside of it, so it was generally untouched by the rest of Sherman's run through Georgia. And Liberty County, along with many other counties and areas in Georgia, South Carolina, and low-country slavery in general, had a tradition of allowing enslaved people to work for their own gain after completing the tasks and on Sundays. That fellow right to the right there is General Judson Kilpatrick. He was a rear Rear Guard Cavalry commander for the right wing of General Sherman's march through Georgia. And after helping in capturing Fort McAllister, he, after running out of supplies and the rest of his group, dipped into Liberty County to forage off the land. And that last part there is super important. The practice was, as I said, super common in low country slavery, but the historians of Liberty County like to say that the practice was much more prominent in the county. So when General Kilpatrick and his troops rode into the county to take clean the plantations, he also ran into a lot of black people with a large amount of agricultural surplus throughout the years. And that leads directly into my methodology, which is I combined the official records of the rebellion, which are official documents of the Civil War, with the Southern Claims Commission files to create a coherent narrative of what occurred during Kilpatrick's 2-week stay in the county and the results of the actions afterwards. And then also I wanted to look into the modern day interpretation of Liberty County's occupations by Liberty County historians. And my findings, the soldiers who took the property of enslaved people clearly saw it as something different than taking from the plantation owners. According to the testimony of the freed slaves, the soldiers would profusely apologize to them and offer them many different forms of reimbursement. And in this specific case, Nancy Johnson was one. It was a very popular file, and the officers offered to take her and her family up to the Carolinas, which was a very bold move. They were really sticking their neck out for the family. General Sherman advised troops to not take along any freed slaves or help them in any way. So by offering to bring them from Savannah all the way up to the Carolinas was a big deal. And then also I mentioned earlier that Liberty County historians describe the practice of allowing slaves to work for their own gain as being very widespread and being much more prominent in the county. And I argue that this was a coherent narrative by the county to make the assertion that pre-Kilpatrick's invasion, everything in the county was generally all right, and Kilpatrick, in coming there, disrupted the kind of racial equilibrium that was there. And those are definitely echoed by Liberty County's modern day museum. And it neglects that this event was the emancipation event for thousands of slaves throughout Liberty County. And it doesn't show the fact that both the officers and the enslaved people of the county saw what happened to them as different than it was happening to the plantation owners. So I'm continuing on this work later as looking into comparisons of South Carolina's experiences under Sherman's March. A lot of sources say that General Sherman's March to the Carolinas was much more punishing than that through Georgia, because South Carolina was the first state to secede, so people felt as if he was punishing them. There's not been much research done on the difference in black population, so I'm looking to see how that kind of looks. So that's what I was doing.
I was dwelling on something again. Jackson did something that everybody did, but nailed it particularly well. The coherent narrative out of a whole chaos of lived experience and the records of different kinds. And so one of the things that I especially thought was good hook. Like I was in this paper in this presentation paper from the very beginning, and that's an advanced skill to weave this good coherent narrative. And I want to congratulate you on that. Our final presentation today is by Emily Tran. Emily is a double major with a history BA and an art and design degree in games and playable media. She'll be graduating this spring. Emily wrote this paper in Professor Greg O'Malley's class, his seminar, History of the Atlantic World, 1492 to 1824. And Emily, this paper won the History Department Peterson Award in Cultural History. So now let us hear from Emily about their paper, Paw Prints of the Past, the transition of the dog's role from the old world to the new world.
Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Emily Tran, and my research paper is called Paw Prints of the Past, the
the dogs in the Americas were a lot larger in size and in muscle mass just due to the rugged nature of colonial America. And so the sources I use include all of these different primary sources over here, and that's just because there's no autobiography of dogs in the 1500s and to the 1700s, so I had to go through a lot of archives and keyword search dog, hound, mastiff, and I looked through all these lovely primary sources and pieced together a narrative with this comparison in mind. So my main argument is dogs act as a reflection of the societal needs of each region. And so in England, dogs served in entertainment purposes and function as status symbols. And this can be seen as dogs being used in spectator sports and the consumerist culture of lap dogs at the time. Whereas colonial America, dogs served as utilitarian tools for control and survival, which can be seen where they use dogs to intimidate indigenous communities and also used to suppress the enslaved population. So these differences reveal England's luxury-focused society, whereas America has a more utilitarian, survival-focused priorities. So our first example that we're going to delve into is animal baiting in England. And if you don't know what animal baiting is, it is a spectator sport where they take a large animal, such as a bull or a bear or a tiger, and they tie them to a post and they have dogs attack it. So in this article over here, in this article, it talks about a bear being strapped with fireworks. This is my visual representation of that. It's an advertisement saying that this is going to happen and trained bulldogs are going to be trained to attack it. And this is happening at the Massachusetts Bear Garden. And during this time period, King versus II had their own bear garden, and it was a pastime, bear baiting and animal baiting, for a lot of the upperclassmen. So you can see in this instance where dogs are being used for entertainment purposes that they even had like a bear baiting ring. They made structures for these activities. And this later transpires into lap dogs and like a social class structure in that kind of way. But let's look at colonial America. So colonial America had a lot different priorities, and I wonder why. But colonial America was focused on the intimidation of indigenous communities, and that's because as they're developing their nation, they were expanding their territories, and they were getting into altercations with Native American communities. And so since they had dogs from England, they would use them to hunt. And while they were hunting, they discovered that the indigenous communities were really intimidated by the dogs. So in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Assembly created an act for raising an increase of dogs to better security of the frontiers. So any dog owner was paid 5 shillings in annual payment to help the hunt surgeon kind of raise like a canine militia to intimidate the indigenous communities and expand their territories. And this later transpired into the ban on treating dogs with quality to Native Americans because they valued and understood the powerful nature of these dogs that they didn't want them getting into like the wrong hands. This later transpires into the use of slave hounds, which I would love to talk about more, but I cannot. So in conclusion, England had a strong, stable infrastructure, which is why they were able to use their dogs in more of an entertainment manner, whereas colonial America is a developing environment. They're building their nation from the ground up. So they were more focused on using dogs as a tool for practical purposes. So dogs act as a lens into the social, economical priorities of each region. And you can also see the societal values in each of these regions through these human-animal relationships. So yeah, thank you so much.
Now is when I confess that my YouTube feed is half Huskies acting selfishly videos. Apparently Huskies are very emotional or something. Anyway, this is a great collection of papers that gives anybody in the audience who isn't familiar with the historical field the range of things that we can do. We've just had a human-animal history. We've had queer community survival. We have had emancipation. We've had material culture. We've had ideology and imagination. We've had political history. There's so many wonderful things going on here, and you can hear all of the methods that they've done, what research looks like, the process of finding things, the excitement of finding things, and then the crafting of great narratives that's represented in all of these papers here. So I'm sure all of my colleagues feel as proud as I do of all of our presenters today. And then one more thing, you have to get up in front of people and tell them sometimes. So I'm also very proud of everybody for doing that so wonderfully. So we have just a couple minutes for a couple questions for our last panel. So if we have anybody who wants to talk generally about dogs, or to Jackson about the emancipation history, or Valerie about the indigenous history in Mohawk. Yes, Molly has a question.
I have a question about your comment. Did you find, I'm not sure if you went this far back or you, like, your research was really limited to that period, but did you find that dogs played a more similar role to how you saw the role they played in America previously in history? So my research focused more on the 1500s to the 1700s, but essentially since dogs kind of started as the role playing hunters in most of these regions, I haven't done much research on England dogs previously, so I can't really answer that question, but I appreciate it.
You have another question? Yeah, Ben?
I loved all the papers, by the way. Congratulations, everyone, and great job presenting as well. That's not easy. So, my History 100 students are here, and one of the things that I've been trying to talk about, and this surfaced really well in Valerie's paper, which was great, is the challenge of connecting something, a historical topic, to the present and present day ways of thinking and concerns, but not being anachronistic. And I think you did a really good job there. And one of the things I was thinking about in your paper is both the pre-Columbian religious exploration history of like scarification and forms of bodily, doing violence to one's body in a Great Lakes religious tradition is like a long thing that goes back probably to thousands of years. So you did a great job contextualizing that. One thing I'm thinking about is in the present, you used the term self-harm, right? So self-harm is like a very much a 21st century concept. So on the surface, it seems anachronistic to use, but I actually thought it was an effective use of the term because it's connecting it to, the current topic. And one thing that occurred to me is another way of reading this as another layer that is in addition to what you looked at was that possibly it was self-harm as a form of dealing with collective trauma. So I was wondering how much that came in and what your thought process was in using that term.
I actually didn't think too much about which term I was using. It was just what I think best described what I was reading. What was the second part of your question?
Just the question of so in addition to seeing this as both a Catholic penance and something else, like an Iroquoian spiritual tradition, is it possible that this group of people had lived through this collective trauma? They even having smallpox and nearly dying of smallpox is something that most of us can't imagine how much that sucks. It's like a horrible thing to go through, especially if you're a teenage girl and you have smallpox and you're recovering from that. This is kind of getting into psychohistory and thinking about people's psychology, but self-harm as just a reaction to what this community was going through and the really difficult time they were having.
Yeah, and I definitely think, I don't know if it was intentional, whether Catherine took advantage of her scarring and the blindness in order to survive in this new context. That's definitely at least that's where I was definitely heading towards. That, this is kind of like another form of survivance, I would say, for Indigenous peoples to take what they already know and place it into a new context where they could, take what they have and place it somewhere where it could be useful, I would say. So I think that's definitely what Kateri did, and I don't know if the priests saw this or they just had their own biases and placed that onto her. But that's definitely where I was heading towards in terms of this being a new form of survivance.
Thanks, Ben, for bringing your class, and thank you, everybody in History 100 for coming here today. I think this should be a tradition going on, that people who are in this research methods class now can see what some of the folks who have come through the program already have been able to accomplish. And again, we're all pretty impressed with the range of things here, so you can be thinking about the range of things that you too could pursue.
And can they come up and ask questions of the presenters if people want to stick around?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We can, if folks can stick around a little bit. I was just reflecting, it was 40 years ago that I turned in my senior thesis. And I still think it's pretty good. I can't find it. And as a more sophisticated historian than I was at the time, I can probably pick it apart. But it's pretty good, and it actually set me on a trajectory for the work that I do now. I don't know where you all are going to go, whether you're going to decide to go into the profession, whether you're going to go on to other things. But I think everybody here would again share my sentiment that this is an impressive, these are impressive pieces of work that you've done, and that you have a lot of bright future ahead of you, however you want to pursue it. So please join me in thanking them all for presenting today. Don't have to rush to something else now. Perhaps you'll welcome some questions for others in a conversation. Thank you again, everybody.